The monitor's rhythmic beeping was the only sound, breaking the suffocating silence in the private hospital suite. 17-year-old Emma Chambers lay, motionless beneath silk sheets that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her once vibrant auburn hair now dull against the pillow. Outside her window, Manhattan glittered with life, taxis honking, people rushing to their next appointment, the world spinning on. But inside this room, time was running out. The doctors had given her 3 days. 3 days before her rare blood disorder would shut down her organs one by one. 3 days before one of the wealthiest families in America would lose their only child. And 3 days before a boy nobody believed in would prove that miracles don't always come wrapped in gold. Michael Chambers had built an empire. Tech mogul, philanthropist, the man whose face graced the covers of Forbes and Time. He could buy anything. Private jets, politicians, entire companies with the signature. But as he stood beside his daughter's bed, his hand trembling as it held hers, he understood the cruel joke the universe had played on him. All his billions couldn't buy the one thing that mattered. Emma needed a bone marrow transplant. And despite testing thousands of potential donors from their exclusive social circles, despite hiring the best medical teams money could assemble, they'd found no match. The transplant list offered no hope. Anyone compatible was too far away or medically unable to donate. The window was closing, and Michael Chambers, the man who'd never lost a deal in his life, was about to lose everything. 11 blocks south, in a part of Manhattan the Chambers family never visited, 16-year-old Danny Torres was doing what he did every day, surviving. The doorway of an abandoned building on the Lower East Side had been his home for 8 months, ever since his mother's addiction had spiraled so far out of control that social services seemed like the better option, and he'd run before they could place him in another foster home. Danny knew the streets, knew which bakery threw out day-old bread at 9 p.m., knew which subway grates were warmest in winter, knew how to be invisible when he needed to be. But what set Danny apart from other street kids wasn't his survival skills. It was the dog-eared medical textbook he carried in his backpack, salvaged from a dumpster behind Columbia University. Danny read it every night by streetlight, memorizing pages about diseases and treatments, dreaming of a future where he could be the doctor nobody believed a kid like him could become. That Tuesday afternoon, Danny was doing his usual rounds, collecting cans for recycling money, when he noticed the crowd gathered around a newsstand. The headline splashed across every paper made him stop cold. Billionaire's daughter dying, no. Donor match found. There was Emma's photo, taken at some charity gala, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Danny had seen in his entire life. But it wasn't the wealth that caught his attention. It was her eyes. Despite the fancy setting, they held the same look. Danny saw in his own reflection someone fighting to stay alive in a world that didn't care. The article mentioned her rare blood disorder, the specific genetic markers needed for a match, the desperate timeline. Danny's mind raced back to a night 6 months ago, when he'd passed out on the street, and a kind paramedic had taken him to a free clinic. They'd run blood tests, told him he had some unusual markers in his blood. Rare stuff, the nurse had said. You ever want to donate? You could save someone with a really specific need. Danny had shrugged it off then. What were the chances a homeless kid's blood would matter to anyone? But now, reading Emma's details, something clicked. The markers matched. He'd memorized enough from his medical textbook to recognize the pattern. His hands started shaking, not from hunger this time, but from the weight of what he was realizing. He could be her match. A street kid nobody looked twice at could save a millionaire's daughter. The rational part of Danny's brain told him to walk away. People like the Chambers family didn't want people like him anywhere near their world. They'd take one look at his torn jacket and dirty sneakers and call security. Besides, what if he was wrong? What if he'd misunderstood the markers? But then he looked at Emma's photo again, and he thought about all the times someone could have helped him and didn't. All the doors slammed in his face. All the times he'd been invisible. If he could help, if there was even a chance, how could he not try? Danny spent the rest of that day doing something he'd never done before, asking for help. He approached a social worker he'd always avoided, explaining his situation with an urgency that finally made her listen. She made calls. Hours passed. Skepticism met every claim, a Homeless teenager thinking he could save a billionaire's daughter sounded like delusion or a scam. But something about Danny's desperation, his detailed knowledge of the medical specifics, made one doctor agree to run a preliminary test. By midnight, Danny was sitting in a community clinic, watching his blood fill vial after vial. The doctor, a weary woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who volunteered her nights at free clinics, kept glancing at him with an expression Danny couldn't read. When the preliminary results came back 2 hours later, her face went white. "I need to make a call," she whispered, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. At 2 a.m., Michael Chambers' private line rang. He was still at the hospital, hadn't left Emma's side, watching her chest rise and fall with increasing labor. When Dr. Chen explained what she'd found, he thought it was a cruel prank. A homeless kid? A perfect match? It was impossible. But desperation makes believers of skeptics, and within an hour, Danny Torres was being rushed to Manhattan Presbyterian in the back of an ambulance, surrounded by doctors who looked at him like he was either a miracle or a mirage. The full testing took 6 hours. Michael Chambers paced the hallway outside the lab, his $1,000 shoes wearing a path in the hospital tile. When the head of hematology finally emerged, tears were streaming down her face. "It's a perfect match," she said. 10 out of 10 markers. I've never seen anything like it. This boy, he can save your daughter." Michael's legs nearly gave out. Then reality crashed in. "Get him prepped. Whatever he needs. I'll pay anything." "Mr. Chambers," the doctor interrupted gently. "He's not asking for money. He just wants to know if we have somewhere he can sleep after the procedure because he doesn't have a home to go back to." That stopped Michael cold. This kid, this boy who could save Emma, was homeless. Had nothing. And his first concern was where he'd sleep after donating his bone marrow. The procedure happened the next morning, racing against Emma's failing body. Danny was scared. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't, but he'd also never felt more certain about anything. As they wheeled him into the operating room, he asked only one thing. "Will she be okay? Emma, will she make it?" The surgeon, a man who'd performed this procedure hundreds of times, felt his throat tighten. "Because of you, son, she has a real fighting chance." The transplant took 4 hours. Danny woke up sore, disoriented. In a private recovery room he later learned was usually reserved for VIP patients. But he didn't care about that. He asked about Emma immediately, and kept asking every hour until 3 days later, a nurse came in with tears of joy in her eyes. "She's responding. The transplant is taking. You saved her life." Michael Chambers came to see Danny that afternoon. This titan of industry, this man who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, stood in the doorway looking smaller than he'd ever looked in his life. He tried to speak, to find words adequate for what Danny had done. But they failed him. Finally, he just said, "Thank you." "Why? Why did you do it?" Danny thought about it. About all the textbook pages he'd memorized. All the nights he'd dreamed of being someone who mattered, someone who could help. "Because I could," he said simply. "And because nobody should die when someone can help them, no matter who they are or where they come from." 3 weeks later, Emma Chambers walked out of the hospital, her father's arm around her shoulders, her body accepting the gift of life that had come from the most unexpected source. Danny was there. No longer homeless, Michael had insisted on setting him up in an apartment, enrolling him in school, establishing a trust for his education. But Danny had made one condition, that Michael establish a foundation to help other kids like him, kids whose potential was buried under poverty and circumstance. "You gave me back my daughter," Michael had said. "I can never repay that." "You can," Danny had replied, "by seeing people like me, by remembering that miracles don't care about bank accounts." As Emma approached Danny in the hospital lobby that day, surrounded by cameras and reporters drawn by a story too beautiful to ignore, she hugged the boy who'd saved her life. 2 teenagers from different worlds, connected by the most fundamental truth, that humanity transcends circumstance, that kindness costs nothing but means everything, and that sometimes the people with the least to give offer the greatest gifts of all. The story made headlines across the country. "Street kid saves millionaire's daughter." But for Danny and Emma, it was never about the headlines. It was about what happened next. Emma using her platform to advocate for homeless youth. Danny eventually becoming the doctor he'd always dreamed of being, and Michael learning to see the world through new eyes, eyes that recognized worth in places he'd never thought to look. Because in the end, Emma Chambers had 3 days to live until Danny Torres proved what too many forget: that every life has value, every person has worth, and the biggest miracles often come from the smallest acts of selfless love.